paying half your life points in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is usually attached to really good effects because of how steep of a cost that can be. And in this list, we'll go over 10 of the worst cards that require you to pay half your life points for their effects. And at number 10, we have Steel Swarm Hercules. This card has the effect where you can pay half your life points to destroy all of the cards on the field once per turn. Now, this effect is actually pretty good, which is why it's at the bottom of this list and probably one of the better cards here. The reason this card does make this list, however, is because of its summoning requirements. In order to bring this card out, you have to normal summon it with 3 tributes. 3 Steel Swarm tributes to be more precise. You can't even use good tribute fodder engines in order to cheat this card out easier, like you can with other monsters that require 3 tributes. Luckily, for Steel Swarms though, they have some pretty decent cards that make bringing this one out not much of a chore. They have an archetype softly revolving around tribute summoning. And some tribute summon focused Steel Swarm decks even saw competitive play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, though none of those decks use Steel Swarm Hercules. They were more revolved around Steel Swarm Girastag and Steel Swarm Moth, monsters who require 1 and 2 tributes for their effects. And that's because getting out 3 tributes for a beat stick whose only effect is to wipe the field is just a tad bit cumbersome, especially when it's just a worse Judgement Dragon. Judgement Dragon has the same effect of destroying all other cards in the field, except it's much easier to bring out, only requires you to pay 1,000 life points for its effect, and it can be used multiple times per turn. And it's really that ease of access that lets Judgement Dragon go down in history as one of the better boss monsters, and why Steel Swarm Hercules never saw play in comparison. And at number 9, we have Cybernetic Fusion Support. This card requires you to pay half your life points in order to gain an effect for the turn, where, if you would fusion summon a machine fusion type monster, you can choose to banish monsters from your graveyard in addition to the field in your hand for that monster's fusion summon, if you use a different fusion card in order to bring out that fusion monster. This card doesn't actually let you fusion summon anything on its own. It just allows you to also use targets from your graveyard, and it only lets you bring out 1 machine fusion monster in this way. So it's kind of like Chain Material, a card that lets you use monsters from your graveyard and deck as fusion materials for the entire turn, except you can't attack that turn, and your fusion monsters are destroyed during the end phase. And Chain Material is actually a pretty good card, which would be very broken if it was a spell card and could be used during your first turn. And since Cybernetic Fusion Support is like a weaker version of Chain Material, I can see why they gave it so many restrictions, only allowing it to use on 1 fusion monster, not allowing you to use monsters from your deck, and requiring you to pay half your life points to do so, where Chain Material doesn't have an activation cost. This card did see some play, however, in 1 Cyber Dragon Kaiju deck that saw some competitive success multiple times, though I wouldn't say this card was a central combo piece in that deck, as it was played as a one-off and wasn't really necessary to the win condition, as most other Cyber Dragon decks forego playing this card, as it's not very good. It's not terrible though, despite the fact that it's making it in this top 10 worst of list. It can essentially turn any polymerization into a miracle fusion, though at the cost of using 2 cards and half your life points, instead of 1 card like Miracle Fusion. And this card does see a lot of play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. You see, there's this special kind of deck that tries to lose as fast as possible. That way players can use it in ranked matches if they want to drop ranking quickly, or farm out skills. And since this card is an easy to use spell card that pays half your life points that doesn't require a board state, it's a very fast way to reduce your life points to a low value so you can burn yourself quicker. Although it's been a while since I've seen people do this, so I'm not sure if this strategy works anymore in that game. And at number 8, we have Dark Magic Curtain. This spell card requires you to pay half your life points to special summon a Dark Magician from your deck. Which, right off the bat, being able to special summon a monster from your deck at the cost of half your life points is a good effect. That's why cards like A Hero Lives sees lots of play and is currently limited on the ban list. However, the card continues to also have another restriction on it, where you cannot summon other monsters the turn you activate this effect. So it locks you out of any other monsters except that 1 Dark Magician you bring out, except for maybe a card you want to set later on. It does allow you to normal set that turn, which is still a really terrible restriction on the card. That's also why no one played a very good card like Red Eyes Fusion until Predaplant Verte Anaconda came out. Red Eyes Fusion would allow you to use monsters from your deck as fusion materials, but since it won't let you summon other monsters for the turn, it didn't really see any competitive play, And Predaplant Verte Anaconda allows you to bypass this restriction and use the effect of the card from your deck, which is why it currently sees tons of play over in the OCG, as well as having a really good target for that fusion card. And that's why, even though it technically has a good effect of special summoning a 2500 attack beatstick from the deck, it never saw any competitive success, despite the fact that Dark Magician decks have recently seen a resurgence, thanks to some new overpowered support cards, and even with the new support, they still don't use this card, because they basically released a better card that does what this card was trying to do, which does such a good job at it that it sees play in other non-Dark Magician decks as well. And at number 7, we have Judgement of the Pharaoh. This is the trap card, which requires you to pay half your life points to select and activate one of two of its effects. The first is if you have YuGiOh Friendship in your graveyard, your opponent can't summon monsters or activate their monster effects for the rest of the turn. If you control Unity in your graveyard, your opponent can't activate set spell or trap cards, and all effects of face-up spell or trap cards are negated until the end of the turn. Now, both of these effects are actually really good. And the only problem with this card is that you have to get these two cards in the graveyard in order to use this effect. YuGiOh Friendship is a unique card which has the potential to change you and your opponent's life points to half of a combination of both of your current life points. So it's only really useful if you're really behind in the game and you have like no life points, and you want to steal some of your opponents, while lowering theirs by a good amount at the same time, which honestly isn't super good. And Unity has the potential to increase the defense of a monster on your side of the field by a whole bunch, which can be useful for certain kinds of decks, but generally, cards that increase the defense are some of the worst cards in the game, as that's one of the worst positive effects in the game technically. And only one archetype makes positive use of their defense, and they don't play spell or trap cards. So having to play 2 dead cards and then get them into the graveyard so that you can use this one card's good effects, which essentially is just a floodgate for a turn, isn't worth it, and that's why this card with 2 technically strong effects doesn't see any competitive play. Having to set up your graveyard in order to pull off a floodgate effect for one turn is too much of a setup when you can just play normal floodgates that don't require you to jump through hoops to activate their effects. And at number 6, we have Mixerroid. This card has an effect on the field where you contribute a machine-type monster to special summon a non-wind Roid monster from your deck. And that effect is actually pretty decent in Roids, as it can allow you to change out a low-level Roid for a high-level Roid from your deck. Although, it doesn't allow you to target any of the speed Roids, since they're all of the wind attribute. And that's by design, because the speed Roids are actually kind of good, whereas the normal Roids are kind of a joke. Now, this card also has a graveyard effect, where you can pay half your life points in order to banish this card, as well as many machine monsters from your graveyard as possible, in order to special summon a Roid fusion monster with the exact same level as the amount of cards banished. Now, there are no speed Roid fusion monsters, so you only have the choice of the Roid fusions, and the lowest level Roid fusion monster is Parapsychroid, which isn't really worth bringing out on its own. That card was kind of made to be brought out with Power Bond, since it can attack directly with its effect, and it very much wants its attack to be doubled in order to make better use of that. And the good Roid monster you would want to bring out is level 10. So having to banish 9 other machine-type monsters from your graveyard is not really a game state that happens very often, not with cards like That Grass Looks Greener being banned. This card is so close to being good. If it just didn't require you to banish so many monsters in order to bring out the good fusion cards, it would totally be worth its life point cost. Or if Roids just had better lower level fusion targets, it might be worth playing. But as it stands now, normal, non-speed Roid decks don't see competitive play, and the addition of Mixerroid, which was a new wave of support cards added to them, did not change that fact. And at number 5, we have Dark Lord Descent. This is a trap card, which requires you to pay half your life points to activate it, which then allows you to special summon up to 2 Dark Lord monsters from your graveyard in defense position, just as long as you meet one other little requirement, which is for your opponent to control a level that is exactly the same as the monsters you want to bring out. And since most of the Dark Lord archetype is level 6 and higher, with the majority of them being around level 8, this is not a game state that you see very often. This card would be a lot better if the Dark Lords had a whole bunch of level 4 monsters, but it's a purely high-level archetype, which means this card sees absolutely no play because it's too difficult to force the requirement yourself. There are ways to do it. You can just give your opponent a kaiju, Most kaijus are high level, and the best one is level 8, which would allow you to bring out the best Dark Lord. And there's even some Dark Lords who can just copy the effect of this card in the graveyard, so you can kind of ignore the other downside of this card to being a trap card, which usually would require you to wait a turn before you could use it. But even though you can copy this card's effect from the graveyard, and you can give your opponent a kaiju in order to make this card live, it's still not played because that's still too much setup. It's kind of like why Judgement of the Pharaoh doesn't see play, even though it technically has 2 good effects. It's just too many hoops to jump through that's not worth it, which is exactly the case with Dark Lord Descent. Even though it technically has a really good effect that the Dark Lord archetype would love to use, it already has a tough requirement to paying half your life points, in a deck that's all about paying a whole bunch of life points to use all of their effects. It's just not live very often, and it doesn't work as a good combo extender, which is what the card is kind of supposed to be. And at number 4, we have Soul Strike. This is a battle trap that can only be activated when you have 4,000 or less life points, which, let me tell you a little something about battle traps. They already see very little play because they're sitting targets for your opponent's spell or trap card removal. And generally, the only trap cards that actually see play on a wide scale are cards that can either be used from your hand, or ones that can be chained to spell and trap card removal, which battle traps cannot be, since they require a specific trigger of the battle taking place. Now, let's continue with the rest of this card's effects. If you meet the conditions of this card, you can pay half your life points and then target one of your face-up monsters, and it will gain attack equal to how much lower your life points are than 4,000 until the end of your opponent's turn. So, since this attack increase applies after you pay life points, if you have exactly 4,000 life points, for example, when you use this card's effect, your life points will go down to 2,000 after you pay the cost. And then you increase the attack of one of your monsters by 2,000, since that's the difference between 4,000 and your current life point value. And it can get even higher. If your life points are at 1,000 when you use this card, you then pay its cost and go down to 500, and your monster would gain 3,500 attack. So you have the potential to gain a whole bunch of attack from this one card, as generally the cap on effects that give monsters attack points is set at around 2,000 max, and rarely do cards give more than 2,000 attack. So this card does have the potential to give a hefty chunk of attack points, but better cards like the Mirror Force cards, which can just get rid of all of your opponent's cards without requiring you to have a weird specific life point value, don't see very much play nowadays, and those cards are technically much more useful than Soul Strike, and don't require you to pay half your life points in order to use them. And at number 3, we have Sabatel, the Philosopher's Stone. Now, this card can allow you to pay half your life points to search out a polymerization spell card from your deck, or a fusion spell card. Now, being able to search out any fusion spell card is actually pretty good, and would definitely be worth paying half your life points for it on a spell card. But you need to have a winged Kariba monster in your graveyard in order to activate this effect, which puts it in the territory of Judgement of the Pharaoh, where it requires you to play subpar cards and get them in the graveyard in order to use a good effect. Which means this card doesn't see any play because that's not worth the cost. Now, this card has another effect, where if you have 3 copies of this card in your graveyard, you can banish all 3 copies in order to increase the attack of one monster on the field by the attack of the highest attack monster on the field. So if you choose a monster you control with 500 attack, and your opponent controls a monster with 4,000 attack, you can increase the attack of your card to 4,500 until the end of the turn. Now, that's not a half bad effect, but it's way too hard to pull off normally, and it's not good enough an effect where you'd want to put resources into getting 3 copies of this card into the graveyard. Although I do believe this card had a much more broken effect in the anime, and this is kind of the watered down version of it, which is probably why it's kind of bad. And at number 2, we have Malefic Truth Dragon. This is a 5,000 attack main deck monster, making it tied with Dystopia the Despondent for having the highest original attack of a main deck monster in the game. And what this card does is if you destroy a monster by battle, it can destroy all of your opponent's other face-up monsters, which, okay, isn't a half bad effect on a monster that has one of the highest original attacks in the game. It's kind of everything else about this card that makes it take a higher spot on this list. You see, you can only summon this card if another Malefic monster you control is destroyed by battle or card effects, in which case you get to pay half your life points to special summon this card from your hand or graveyard. And if there's no face-up field spell card on the field, this card destroys itself. So not only does it have no protection, it has a weakness while on the field, where if your opponent just destroys your field spell card, this card will destroy itself. Now here's the thing about the Malefic archetype. They're better used as support cards to other decks than they are used in their own deck, and Malefic Truth Dragon really requires you to play a pure Malefic deck for it to actually hit the field, since only in a Malefic deck would you be playing this card and getting it into your hand or graveyard, as other decks that play the good Malefic cards, like Malefic Cyber Dragon or Malefic Stardust Dragon, kind of use them as extenders or big beat sticks, because all of the Malefic monsters have this negative effect where other monsters cannot attack while the Malefic monster's on the field, and you can only control one face-up Malefic monster. This restriction is so bad that they release a new support card for Malefic monsters, specifically the card Malefic Territory, which straight up changes the effects of Malefic monsters on the field, so they no longer have that restriction. You know an archetype is in trouble when they release new support cards that change a shared effect amongst all their monsters. And even with Malefic Territory being released, Malefic decks still don't see competitive play, even if Malefic one-offs occasionally see play in decks as combo extenders. And at number 1, we have Vanity's Call. This card can only be activated as a chain link 4 or higher, and requires you to pay half your life points in order to use it, in which case you get to negate all other effects in the same chain as this card and destroy them. Now, on paper, this seems like a really powerful effect, being able to negate a whole bunch of cards at once if your opponent is going through a huge chain link for some kind of combo. But this is actually an incredibly situational scenario, which doesn't happen very often. Usually chain links end at 2, and you'd have to increase the chain link with one of your own cards in order to be able to activate this card as the 4th chain link, in which case you'd lose that card you used in order to force this card's activation, trading 2 for 2 on your opponent while also losing half your life points in the process. That's why cards like Accumulated Fortune exist without any restrictions on the ban list. It's a trap card that allows you to draw 2 cards without any other negative side effects for the rest of the turn, and all you have to do is activate it as a chain link 4 or higher. And this can only be commonly done in chain burn decks, a deck specifically revolving around getting a whole bunch of chain link setups so that you can use cards like Accumulated Fortune to gain advantage. And Vanity's Call does not work at all in those decks. They're trying to get chain links high so they can gain beneficial effects for themselves, not negate every other card in that chain. Honestly, if they just dropped the chain link requirement of this card down to 3 instead of 4, it would probably be really good. But 4 is just one too high that makes it almost useless, which is why it takes the top spot on this list. Though I would not say it easily takes the top spot on this list. This card definitely has potential to be pretty good if used against a future deck that has a whole bunch of chain links in it. But as it stands now, it's more right to call this card an incredibly niche counter card that's probably not worth playing outside of very specific situations. Alright, and that's the list. This video idea was suggested to me in one of the comments of a previous video. So if you have any ideas similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, to potentially make them in future videos. And did you know, only about 30% of people who watch this channel are actually subscribed to it?